I filed the transfer request on my first day. That is the truth I have been turning over since I sat down in the staff anteroom with the withdrawal form in my hands, and I think it is the right place to begin. Not with what came after, not with the part I am still working to understand, but with the first day, when I arrived at Suite 14 of the Velkuth Cultural Exchange Wing, and understood immediately that I had made a serious mistake by accepting the assignment. The mistake was not the suite itself. The suite was adequate, 3 connected rooms, a kitchen alcove with a window that faced the transit plaza, a balcony with a wrought iron railing that had begun to rust at the lower hinges, a narrow service corridor running behind the main bedroom wall. I had worked in worse postings. The mistake was the resident. I had known before I arrived. You do not receive a placement in the exchange wing without reading the residential profile. Orrin Dale, 41, compact diplomatic resident, seconded from the Velinari Administrative Liaison Division. Former field medic, 12 years, deployment and installation support both. Now a cultural attaché of the mid-grade variety, which meant he attended meetings, filed reports, and stayed in his suite a great deal while the senior attachés attended the dinners. He was not senior enough to be invited to. The profile described him as undemanding and self-sufficient. It did not need to describe anything else. I had already understood what I was walking into. He was human. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say that, because the word covers a great deal of territory, and not all of it is what the Velmoth household doctrine teaches. My grandmother used a different word. My grandmother would have said that humans were appetite given a face, that they wanted things without discipline and pursued them without restraint, and that any Velmoth female who placed herself in proximity to a human male of working age was inviting a situation she would not be able to manage. My grandmother said this the way she said most things, as a fact that required no evidence because it had always been true. My mother said it slightly less often but with the same certainty. I grew up understanding that this was what humans were, that it was not a prejudice but an observation, and that the exchange wing posting was the sort of assignment you declined if you had any sense. I had no sense that morning. I had accepted the assignment because the senior housekeeper, Matron Velseth, had told me there was no one else available, and the compact's residential protocol required the suite to have an assigned domestic attendant within 48 hours of occupancy. I had told her I would do it for 1 week. She had written that down and not looked at me again. Something in her stillness suggested she had heard that particular sentence before, from other domestic staff, in other circumstances, and had drawn her own conclusions. At the time, I did not know what those conclusions were. Later, I thought I understood. So I arrived at Suite 14, let myself in with the staff passkey, set my carry bag on the hook inside the service corridor, and began the intake inventory. He was at the kitchen counter with his back to me. He was making tea. Not tea from the compact's standard residential supply. There was a small tin beside the kettle, something he had brought himself, and the smell that crossed the kitchen when he lifted the lid was sharp and dark, and nothing like the pale citrus blends in the standard provision cabinet. He did not turn around when the service door opened. He said, without looking at me, "The maintenance log is on the second shelf in the service corridor. There's a problem with the ventilation unit above the range. It's been sticking on the exhaust cycle. I've noted it." I told him I would log it with facility services. He said I already did. They told me 3 weeks. I said I could escalate the request. He said he would handle it himself when he had the time and the right tool, and then he turned around and looked at me for the first time. I had been braced for the look. I had been told about the look, the human male's particular way of taking inventory of a Velmoth female, the thing my grandmother described as appetite given a face, the thing she said you would see in the first 10 seconds and could not mistake for anything else. Orrin Dale looked at me the way a man looks at a person who has just entered a room he is already occupied in. He registered my presence. His eyes moved to my face, as is natural when a person enters your space, and then he said, "Cern Velmoth, I've read your file. I'll try not to be in your way." Then he turned back to his tea. That was the whole of the first morning. I did the intake inventory. I checked the provision cabinet, restocked what was low, noted 3 items that would need ordering by the end of the week. I checked the linen cupboard in the service corridor and counted the sets and found 1 set short. I found the maintenance log on the second shelf where he had said it would be and read his entry on the ventilation unit, 2 sentences, precise, diagnostic, listing the symptom and the frequency. I checked the balcony door latch, which was stiff but functional. I made my notes. I did my work. He stayed at the kitchen table and read documents. He did not speak to me again except to say, when I moved past him to reach the lower cabinet, "Go ahead," which I had not asked him for but which moved him a quarter step back from the counter so that I had the space I needed without having to ask. I filed the transfer request at the end of that shift and left it in Matron Velsath's queue. I wrote in the notes field that I believed the assignment was unsuitable for my qualifications and that I would prefer a posting in one of the standard Velketh residential suites serving the established households in the main residential block. I did not write that I was afraid. I was not afraid exactly. But I had been raised to understand what proximity to a human male meant, and I had watched him turn away from me with the ease of someone who had genuinely already moved on to the next thing, and something about that ease was more unsettling than the inventory look I had prepared for. The look I could have managed. The ease I did not know what to do with. I filed the request and went home and told myself I had done the right thing. Matron Velsath did not process it for 6 weeks. Later she told me this was an administrative delay caused by the volume of requests in the quarter. At the time I believed her without fully examining the claim. Now I am less certain. Now I think she may have read the situation in a way I was not yet capable of reading it, and made a decision accordingly, and had the patience to let 6 weeks do the work that no conversation of hers could have accomplished. Those 6 weeks are what I have been trying to understand since I sat in the staff anteroom with the withdrawal form. The ventilation unit above the range. He fixed it on the 4th day. Not 3 weeks, not with a crew from facility services arriving with their clipboards and their standard issue equipment. I came in on the 4th morning, and the unit was running clean. I could hear it from the service corridor. The difference between the stuck grinding exhaust cycle I had listened to for 3 mornings and the clean pull of a unit working as designed. And there was a tool on the counter. Something from his kit bag. A flathead driver with a rubberized handle worn at the grip from long use, and the maintenance log had a new entry in his handwriting. Exhaust cycle recalibrated. Adjusted blade tension on the interior shaft. Reseated the housing mount. The left bolt had backed out approximately 2 turns. Should hold. I stood in the kitchen and read the entry twice. I did not know why it bothered me, or I knew but I did not want to name it. What bothered me was asterisk should hold, those 2 words at the end of a technical entry in a maintenance log that I was the person responsible for maintaining. He had written it as if the log was a conversation, as if I was the audience, as if what I would find useful was not just the record of what he had done, but his assessment of whether the repair would last, which was, in fact, exactly what would be useful to know when I was the person monitoring the suite. He had written for a reader. He had written for me. I put the log back on its shelf and restocked the provision cabinet and did not say anything about the ventilation unit because what was there to say? He had fixed it. It should hold. I went about my work. On the 6th day, he learned my name. Not my name from the file. He had read the file. He had known my name before I walked through the door. He had said it correctly on the first morning. 2 syllables with the emphasis on the first. The Velmoth standard, which most non-Velmoth speakers got wrong because they had learned our names from written compact records that did not indicate the stress pattern. He had said it right immediately and had not corrected himself since. What happened on the 6th day was something different. The senior attaché's aide came through the suite just before midday, a Velinari male in the administrative grade, one of the people who managed the flow of meetings and documents for the section above Orendale's level, a person who passed through the exchange wing's residential corridor as if the corridor was in his way. He passed me in the kitchen alcove and said, "Attendant Velmoth," in the clipped formal register that the administrative grade used for domestic staff, the register that put you in your category efficiently and moved on. I do not flinch visibly. I have trained that out of myself over years of postings where flinching would have been a problem. But there is a slight adjustment, a weight shift, a thing that happens in the set of my shoulders when someone uses that register with me. And Orendale was sitting at the kitchen table with a document, and he saw it. The aide did not notice. He delivered whatever message he had come to deliver, something about a schedule change for the following morning, and left. Orendale looked at his document for a moment after the door closed. Then he set it down. He said, "Cern," with no preamble, the same way he said everything as a plain report, and when I looked at him he said, "Is that better?" I looked at him. He said it as if the question had a simple answer and he was waiting for the simple answer, not for an explanation of why the other form was worse or a performance of gratitude for his having noticed. Just, "Is this better?" I said yes, it was better. He said good, and picked the document back up. I went into the service corridor to do the linen count, which did not need doing but which gave me somewhere to go that was not the kitchen, where I had just been seen in a way I had not expected to be seen, by a person I had arrived prepared not to trust. In the 2nd week, I developed a theory. The theory was necessary. Without it, I had a collection of observations I could not arrange into a shape that made sense given what I had been told about humans, and an incoherent collection of observations was more dangerous than a wrong theory, because a wrong theory at least tells you what to watch for. The theory was that Orendale was performing consideration deliberately, that what looked like attentiveness was a long approach, a practice patience, and that my grandmother had been right about the underlying nature, and I simply had not yet seen the thing she had described because he was experienced at not showing it too early. I watched for the performance to slip. It did not slip. On the 9th day, he made his evening meal. Not for me, he was not cooking for me, and I want to say this clearly because the sequence could be misread, and I have spent time ensuring I tell it correctly. He was making something from a packet he had brought with him that required a long simmer, and the smell that came from the range was substantial, warm and dark, something with protein and something sharp that I did not have a name for. I came through the kitchen to retrieve a restocking item from the lower cabinet, and he looked up from the simmering pot and said, "There's enough." Then he looked back at the pot. There is enough, not, "Do you want some?" with the weight of anticipated gratitude in the question. Not, "I made extra" with the implication that the extra was for me. There is enough, a neutral report of conditions. Whether or not I chose to make use of that condition was entirely my own affair, and he was not going to watch to see what I decided. I said I had eaten. He said, "All right," and reached for the stirring spoon. That was the whole of it. I went home that evening and sat in my own kitchen and thought about that exchange for longer than it warranted. What I was thinking, and I did not want to think it because of what it would mean for the theory, was that the way he had said asterisk "there's enough" was the same way he wrote asterisk should hold in the maintenance log. Practical, aimed at the useful, offered and then released with no attachment to what I did with it. There was enough food. The repair should hold. Here is the information. What you do with it is yours. I thought about appetite without restraint, which was what my grandmother had described, and I thought about a man who said, There's enough, and went back to stirring, and I thought that these were not the same thing. I did not discard the theory yet, but it was becoming difficult to maintain. By the end of the third week, I had abandoned it. What replaced it was not a theory. What replaced it was a more careful attention to what I was actually observing, without the framework I had built to pre-interpret it. This was more uncomfortable than the theory. A theory tells you what everything means before you have to look at it too closely. Without the theory, I had to look. So I looked. I looked at the way he moved through the suite, unhurried, aware of where I was without tracking me, giving way without making a performance of it. The service corridor door. He had begun to hold it a half-second longer than necessary when he heard me coming, not looking up from whatever he was carrying, just the held door. The supply log. When he used the last of something, the dark tea, which ran out in the third week, or the specific grade of cleaning compound I used on the range surface, he noted it in the supply log rather than waiting for me to notice the absence on my next shift. The notes were in the same handwriting as the ventilation unit entry. They had the same quality, information transferred cleanly, with the assumption that I was the person who would use it. On the 19th day, I arrived for the morning shift and found that the supply of Velmoth standard cleaning compound was low. Before I could note it, I found that he had already noted it. And the following morning when I came in, the compound was restocked. A new container on the shelf, the same grade I used, sourced from the Exchange Wing supply office, which was a 10-minute walk from the suite and was not a resident's responsibility under any version of the compact's residential protocol I had ever worked under. He had walked to the supply office for a cleaning compound he did not use. I stood at the shelf with the new container in my hands for a moment. Then I put it in its place and wrote in the supply log that the item had been restocked and noted the date. I did not write anything else, but I thought about the 10-minute walk, and I thought about the deliberate quality of it, not the grand gesture, not the presented gift with the expectation of response, just the 10-minute walk to a supply office and a container on the shelf, as if it were the obvious thing to do when someone who shared your space was running low on something they needed. The second chair at the kitchen table was the thing that accumulated most quietly. He always worked at the kitchen table in the mornings and the late afternoons when he was in the suite. He sat at one side, the side nearest the window which had the better light for reading. The chair across from him, the second chair, was always pulled out. Not all the way, not pushed back into the room. 30 centimeters, roughly, just enough. It took me 11 days to understand why. I read standing. I have always read standing when I am in a space that is not my own, at the counter, where the height is right and I feel less like I am occupying someone else's furniture. I had been reading my shift roster and my maintenance schedules at the counter in his kitchen for 11 days. And somewhere in those 11 days he had noticed, and somewhere after that he had begun pulling the second chair out by 30 centimeters, and he had never said a word about it. It was an invitation that required nothing. I could sit and I could stand, and the chair would simply be there either way, pulled out its 30 centimeters, available without comment, never withdrawn, never reduced because I hadn't used it. I did not sit in it, but I looked at it every morning, and some mornings looking at it felt like a small act of discipline. On the day that marked 4 weeks, I was finishing the afternoon inventory in the service corridor when I heard him come back from the second meeting. The transit corridor assessment, which ran until midday, and then the documentation review that finished by the second hour of the afternoon. I had learned his schedule by this point, not deliberately, not as surveillance, but the way you learn any rhythm that shares your space. His key in the main door. His bag set down on the chair inside. The particular sequence of sounds that meant he was back and settling. I was nearly done with the inventory when I heard him stop in the main corridor. Then his footsteps coming toward the service door. He knocked. He always knocked before opening the service corridor door from his side, though it was his suite and he had every right to open it without knocking, and I had never told him to knock because it had not occurred to me to need to. He just did it. He knocked and said, "Cern, are you still in?" And I said yes, and he opened the door. He said, "The second balcony hinge. The rust has gotten into the joint on the lower bracket. I've ordered the replacement part. It'll be 3 days. I wanted to make sure you knew before you use the balcony. Don't lean on the right side railing until the part comes in." He was looking at me with the steady, even attention he gave everything. Not at my face in a way that was more than information transfer. At me, the person standing in the service corridor, who would be using the balcony twice a day for the next 3 days. I said I would be careful. He said, "Good, safe travels." He closed the door. I stood in the service corridor and counted 4 seconds. 4 seconds during which I was looking at a closed door and trying to account for what had just happened. What had happened was that a man had come looking for me before I left to tell me about a rust hazard on a railing I might lean on, and the entire exchange had been about my safety and nothing else, and the door had closed without any of the other things my grandmother had told me to watch for. I walked home through the transit plaza in the late afternoon and tried to remember the last time someone had gone slightly out of their way to warn me to be careful. I could not find a specific instance. My household lead tracked my assignments but not my safety, which was my own responsibility. My previous residents had not tracked me at all. My family assumed I was competent, which was true and was also its own kind of silence. I did not tell my grandmother about the balcony hinge. The 5th week brought a morning that I replay sometimes when I am trying to understand how I arrived at the staff anteroom with the withdrawal form in my hands, and the decision already made before I understood I had made it. I was 20 minutes early for my shift. This occasionally happened, the transit timing aligned or misaligned in ways that compressed or extended my travel, and on this morning it had compressed, and I was through the service door before the morning had fully organized itself. He was on the balcony. The door to the kitchen was half open, the way he sometimes left it when the morning was clear and the transit plaza light was good, and I could see him through the gap, standing at the railing with his tea, looking out over the plaza. Not at anything specific. Just looking. The particular quality of a person who has a full day ahead of them and is spending 5 minutes outside of it, standing still, letting the morning be the morning. I should have made a noise to announce myself. I did not immediately. I stood on my side of the service door for a moment and watched him through the half-open kitchen door, and what I saw was a man who was not performing anything because there was no one to perform for. He thought he was alone. His shoulders were the shoulders of a person who is simply present in a place, without arrangement. The hand around the teacup was loose. His face, in profile, was the face of a person looking at a transit plaza in the morning, weathered and quiet and unremarkable. I had spent 5 weeks watching him perform consideration for me. That was the word I had been using internally, perform, because it protected me from the alternative. What I saw through the half-open door was a person who looked exactly the same when there was no one watching, the same quality of stillness, the same unhurried presence. The shoulders did not change when he heard the service door and turned and said, "Good morning, Cern," because the shoulders had nothing to change to. They were already what they were. He stepped back inside. He said, "The second balcony hinge is better. The part came in yesterday." He said it because it was relevant information. I had been told not to lean on the right side, and now I could. He went to the table and opened his documents. I went to the provision cabinet and stood there for a moment doing nothing, which is unusual for me and which I noted without yet understanding. In the 6th week, I began to notice the kettle. This is the detail that should be the least significant, and it is also the detail I come back to most. In the 6th week, in the mornings especially, on the days when I came in through the service door and the suite was quiet and the plaza light was still the early gray-blue before the transit surge, I found that I was listening for the kettle before I opened the door. Not consciously, not as a monitoring behavior. The sound of it had simply become part of the structure of the morning. The particular lower pitch of his tin kettle, which was not the compact standard, and had a sound I could identify through the door. I heard it and something in me settled. I noticed this on the 23rd day of the 6th week, and I stood with it for a moment before I filed it. I filed it under professional attunement, a domestic attendant learning a resident's routine. This is a real thing, a genuine professional phenomenon, and the category was not wrong exactly. But I knew, even as I filed it, that I was using the category to avoid the other category, the one that was harder to hold. Matron Velseth called me into her office at the end of the 6th week. She slid the transition paperwork across the desk. Standard form, the exchange wing's administrative template, with my name and assignment history and the reference number of the original transfer request. She said the delay had been administrative. She said the Eastern Bloc posting in the Velinari noble household was confirmed, and I could begin the transition by the end of the week. I looked at the paperwork. She waited. I said I needed to think about it. She used the particular silence that means she has already understood something I have not finished understanding yet. Then she said she would hold the transition for 48 hours. I went to the staff anteroom. The small room with 4 chairs and the wall of open cubbies and the standing terminal and the window onto the inner courtyard. I sat in one of the chairs and I held the transition paperwork, and I looked at the maintenance equipment carts parked in the courtyard below. I stayed there for a long time. What I was doing in that anteroom was something I had been avoiding for 6 weeks. I was putting the two things in the same room, my grandmother's word and the 6 weeks, and looking at them together. My grandmother's word, appetite, pursuit without restraint, the thing you would see in the first 10 seconds, the thing you could not mistake, the thing that made proximity dangerous, that made the exchange wing posting the assignment you declined if you had sense. The 6 weeks, a ventilation unit fixed on the 4th day, with a log entry that said should hold. A name said correctly on the first morning and correctly every morning since. A second chair pulled out 30 centimeters every day without comment. A supply of cleaning compound restocked by a 10-minute walk that was not his responsibility. A balcony hinge noted, and the information carried to me before I left. A kettle I could identify through a closed door by its pitch. And the thing I had seen through the half-open kitchen door. The man on the balcony, who was exactly the same when no one was watching. I sat in the anteroom, and I held those two things, and I waited to see which one was larger. It was not a close contest. I went back to Matron Velseth's office, and I told her I was withdrawing the transfer request. She looked at me. She said, "All right." She did not ask me to explain it, and I was grateful for that because I could not yet have explained it in a way that would have satisfied either of us. The withdrawal was the honest thing. The explanation would take longer. She took the transition paperwork back and wrote something in her ledger. As I was leaving, she said, without looking up, "Suite 14 is a good posting." She said it the way she said most things, neutral, factual, as if she were reporting the weather. I did not respond. I let myself out. I walked back through the exchange wing. It was mid-afternoon. The plaza light would be at the angle that came through the kitchen window and lay across the counter at a low slant, the angle that was best for reading if you were standing at the counter, which I was. He would be back from the documentation review by now. I let myself in with the passkey. He was at the kitchen table, document open in front of him, the posture of a man in the middle of something, not at its end. He heard the service door and said without looking up, "Good afternoon, Cern." Said it the way he said everything. A plain report of a true thing. The afternoon was good. She was here. I said good afternoon. I went to the provision cabinet and ran my hand along the shelves. Everything was in order. I had been here in the morning. Nothing should need restocking until the following day. I ran my hand along the shelves anyway. Behind me, I heard him turn a page. I took out my shift roster. I stood at the counter, where the light was right, and I opened it. He was at the table. I was at the counter. The afternoon had the particular quality it always had in this suite at this hour, not quite silence, because he was at the table and I was at the counter, and there was the transit plaza below the window and the low sound of the exchange wing's ventilation system overhead, but close enough to silence that you could hear the page turn. After a while he said, without looking up, "The lower cabinet hinge on the right side is getting stiff. I'll see about a replacement." I said, "I can log it." He said, "Either way." He turned another page. I looked at my roster. Below us in the plaza the transit surge was beginning, the late afternoon exchange of pedestrian traffic, the relay station cycle, the ordinary sound of the working quarter. The kettle on the range had gone quiet. The afternoon light moved on the counter surface by a degree or two as the plaza light shifted. I got out my pen and I opened the maintenance log. I wrote, "Lower cabinet hinge, right side stiffening noted, replacement part to be sourced." I held the pen over the line for a moment. Then I added, "Will monitor." I put the log back on its shelf. I do not know when it became what it is. I do not know at what point in 6 weeks the thing shifted from the professional category I had been using, attunement, familiarity, the ordinary learning of a shared space, into the category that does not have a professional name. I know that the chair was pulled out 30 centimeters this morning, and it was there in the same position when I arrived this afternoon. And when I stood at the counter with my roster, I looked at it the way I have been looking at it for weeks, with the particular attention of someone who is deciding something. I put my roster down on the counter. I crossed the kitchen. I sat in the second chair. He did not look up. He turned a page. He said after a moment, "There's tea if you want it." "Still warm." He said it the way he said everything, a neutral report. "There is tea. Whether I wanted it was mine to decide." I said, "Thank you." He said nothing. He read. I sat in the second chair that had been pulled out 30 centimeters for 6 weeks and waited for morning, which is still some hours away, and I held the thing I am starting to understand has no name in my grandmother's vocabulary. My grandmother had a word for what she thought this would be. She said it clearly and often, and with the certainty of someone who believed she was protecting me. Her word was not large enough for a man who writes asterisk should hold in a maintenance log, and pulls a chair out 30 centimeters, and walks 10 minutes to a supply office for a cleaning compound he will never use. Her word was not large enough for this. I think I am going to need a different word. Orrin Dale had been in the exchange wing for 7 months before I arrived. I know this because I read the full residential file after the 3rd week, when the theory was already failing, and I needed something more detailed to argue against. 7 months in a mid-grade diplomatic posting. In a suite he maintained himself to a standard that the facility's log consistently rated as the lowest maintenance in the wing. The maintenance coordinator's notes used the word cooperative twice and self-sufficient 3 times, which are not words that appear in most residential logs, where the standard entry is either a complaint or a repair ticket. His entries were diagnoses. When something was wrong, he identified it precisely, and either fixed it himself or provided the facility's crew with enough information that they could fix it in half the time a standard call-out would take. I read the 7 months of log entries in one sitting, in the staff anteroom, on a day when my shift ended early, and I had time I did not know what to do with. The entries were consistent. That was what I was looking for, the inconsistency, the point where the performance of self-sufficiency and cooperative regard had slipped, and you could see the thing underneath. 7 months of entries. The tone did not vary. The quality of observation did not vary. Whatever was underneath, if there was a different thing underneath, It did not show in 7 months of interaction with the facility's crew, the senior attendant who had held my post before me, the exchange wing's administrative staff, the aides who came and went with documents. I closed the file and sat in the anteroom for a while. The previous domestic attendant for Suite 14 was a Velinari woman named Sarath who had held the posting for 3 months before requesting a transfer. Her transfer note said personal reasons. I had read this in the file on the first day and had understood it to mean what I thought it meant, that she had been in proximity to a human resident and had found the situation untenable. Now, sitting in the anteroom after the 7th month's worth of consistent log entries, I was less certain what her personal reasons had been. She had left, and I was here, and there was nothing in the log or in the facility's record or in Matron Velsath's filing that told me whether Sarath had left because of Oren Dale or in spite of him. I thought about asking Matron Velsath. I decided not to. The question would have told her more about my current state of mind than I was ready to disclose. In the 4th week, something else happened that I have been careful about where I place in the telling. He was working on a translation problem. He had mentioned it once, in passing, in the kitchen, a Velkith diplomatic document that had been rendered into standard compact administrative language by the section's translation unit, and the rendering had shifted the meaning of one key passage in a way that had implications for a scheduling agreement. He was cross-referencing the Velkith original against the administrative rendering, and finding that the unit's choice of a particular compact administrative term had understated a conditional clause that in the original carried considerably more weight. I knew this because he was working at the kitchen table one afternoon with both documents open, and he was making notes in the margin of the rendering in a handwriting that was very small and very precise, and I was restocking the provision cabinet, and he said, half to himself, "Velkith conditional particles." Not to me, not as a question. I said, "The 4th class or the 5th?" He looked up. I said, "The Velkith conditional has 6 particle classes. The 4th and 5th are the ones that translate ambiguously into compact administrative standard. The 4th suggests strong probability. The 5th suggests certainty with a reserved exception. In compact administrative language, they both tend to render as likely, which loses the distinction." He looked at me for a moment. He said, "Which one is this?" He turned the Velkith document so I could see the passage. I looked at it. I said, "5th class. That passage is saying this will happen unless a specific named condition is not met. Not probably, certainly with one exception." He said, "That's what I thought." He made a note. He said, "Thank you," and looked back at the document. I put the restocking item away and closed the cabinet. He did not ask me where I had learned Velkith conditional grammar. He did not ask whether I had studied it formally or whether it was from my household background or whether I had particular expertise in translation. He had needed information. I had provided it. It had been useful. He had thanked me and returned to the work. I was not required to explain myself. I was not required to perform the expertise or provide credentials for it. I had said what I knew, and it had been received as what it was. I stood at the counter for a moment after the cabinet was closed. Then I went to the linen cupboard and counted the sets again, which did not need counting, because I needed somewhere to go. Later that week, he left a small book on the counter. Not on the kitchen table, on the counter where I stood. It was a Velkith grammatical reference text, the kind used in administrative training, not an academic text, a practical one, with the conditional particle classes in a table near the back. There was a slip of paper inside marking the conditional section. The book had no note. It was simply on the counter when I came in on the morning shift. I stood there looking at it for a moment. Then I picked it up and put it on the supply shelf, where I would not leave things on the counter that did not belong there. I would return it to him at the end of the shift. I did not return it at the end of the shift. I had moved it to the supply shelf, and at the end of the shift it was still on the supply shelf and I left it there. By the following morning, I had decided that moving it back to the counter would make something out of it that he had clearly not intended to make anything out of. It was a reference text. It was useful. It could live on the supply shelf where I kept useful things. It is still on the supply shelf. I look at it sometimes when I am putting other items away. These are the weeks I have been turning over. These specific details in this specific order: the ventilation unit, the name, the food, the cleaning compound, the balcony hinge, the book, the chair, the kettle, each one small enough by itself that I could have placed it in the professional category without any strain, each one in sequence making the professional category slightly smaller than the truth required. My people's dread of human romance is not, I should say, a simple thing. It is not fear of violence. I do not think my grandmother was afraid of Dale the way you would be afraid of something dangerous. The dread is more specific than that. It is the dread of what my grandmother called the One Direction current, the way human men were said to pull toward what they wanted without accounting for what the other person wanted, the way the want itself became the thing that structured the relationship, and anything you put in place to manage, it became something to be worked around rather than respected. The dread was of being in a current you could not see until it had already moved you somewhere you had not chosen. I spent 6 weeks watching for the current. What I found was a man who fixed things and restocked things, and held doors and noted hazards, and pulled chairs out and wrote log entries that addressed me as if I were a capable adult who would know what should hold meant and what to do with the information. What I found was a man who received a piece of grammatical information from a domestic attendant and used it and said thank you and returned to his document. What I found, on a morning when I was early and he was on the balcony with his tea, was a man who looked exactly the same when there was no one watching. That, I think, is the thing I cannot explain to my grandmother. That is the thing her word does not have room for. She described appetite without restraint. What I have been living in for 6 weeks is something that looks, from the outside, almost like its opposite. A man who wants nothing from me that I have not already given, who arranges his space to make mine easier without requiring anything in return, who leaves a book on a counter and attaches no obligation to it. A man who reports information and asks nothing back. I am not so naive as to think there is nothing here. I sat in the second chair this afternoon, and I said thank you for the tea, and he said nothing and went back to his document, and what I felt in that moment was not the settling of a professional matter. I know what the settling of a professional matter feels like. What I felt was different, and I am not yet able to name it precisely, but I know that I have been oriented toward the sound of his kettle in the morning for several weeks, and that this is not something that happens with a professional assignment. What I am sitting with now, in the chair that has been pulled out for me every day for 6 weeks, is the question of what happens next, not urgently. The question has a patience to it that I recognize, because it is the same patience I have seen him bring to everything: the ventilation unit, the translation problem, the morning on the balcony. The patience of a person who is not in a hurry to resolve things before they are ready to be resolved. I think I learned that from him, without knowing I was learning it. I will be here tomorrow morning. I will come in through the service door, and the kettle will be on, and the second chair will be pulled out its 30 centimeters, and the lower cabinet hinge will be slightly stiff on the right side, and someone will have noted it in the log. I will stand at the counter with my roster in the light from the plaza window, and he will be at the table with his documents, and we will do our work together in the same space, and the morning will be the morning. This is what I chose when I withdrew the transfer request. I am beginning to understand that it is also something I am choosing now, sitting in the second chair at the kitchen table in Suite 14 of the Velkuth Cultural Exchange Wing, with the transit plaza going about its evening business 6 floors below, and the maintenance log on its shelf with my entry in it. will monitor, and the particular quiet of a shared space that has settled into itself. My grandmother will not understand this. I have made my peace with that. Her word was not wrong exactly. It simply was not about this. It was not about a man who writes asterisk should hold like it is a promise to a person he respects, and pulls a chair out by 30 centimeters and leaves it there every day in case she changes her mind, and who says, "Good morning," as if the morning were genuinely good and her presence in it were genuinely noted. I need a different word for that. I do not have it yet. But I think I have the time to find it.